In today's show, I am talking to Dr. Mark M. Smith, Carolina Distinguished Professor of History and Director of the Institute for Southern Studies at the University of South Carolina. Mark is the author of numerous books on history and the history of the senses, and in this show we are focusing on two of his most recent books, Emotion, Sense, Experience, co-authored with Rob Boddice, and A Sensory History Manifesto. Starting with basic definitions of human experience, lived experience, and the history of the senses, we address the central role the senses play in understanding experience, especially experience in the past. In both books, Professor Smith advocates for a broader dialogue on the treatment of the senses, the need for a more situated context in methodological investigations that would lead to a more accurate, robust, and ultimately more meaningful history of human experience. Mark also believes that the future of sensory history would greatly benefit from a wider interdisciplinary engagement of the community at large. In the second part of the show, we tackle issues related to the role of technology, especially artificial intelligence, in shaping our awareness and use of the senses, as well as practices of history of the senses. Specifically, advances in immersive technologies, including the metaverse, would eventually make possible Alain Corbin's famous meditation on the tight connection between the senses and emotions. There is no other way, he said, to know men of the past than by trying to borrow their glasses and to live their emotions. And of course, we had to close the discussion with a short incursion in the sensory shift brought by the pandemic. Ethical implications of consuming, using, and monetizing historical experience were also addressed. Here is the show. Hello, Mark. It is nice to have you on the show.
My pleasure entirely. Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, thank you for coming. So let's give some context to our audience by covering some important terminology first. You are a historian, American historian, and also a historian of the senses. So what do you mean by the history of the senses, and how do you define human experience? In particular, here in your work, you refer to lived experience as well as the sensory experience and knowledge.
I'm glad that you started by saying that I'm an American historian, which is true. And it's that background, especially in the history of the American South. I started my career studying slavery and the history of race. And it was from that background that I became interested in the history of the senses, which of course has more than just one name. Some people use the history of the senses. More commonly, it's known as sensory history. And essentially and clumsily, it means that we would be well advised to take into account the multi-sensory ways in which people experience the world in the past. So the premise here is quite simple. We experience the world not just through sight now, but through sound and taste and touch. And to assume that our ancestors didn't is rather a conceit. And sensory history is dedicated to excavating those sensory experiences in the past. And in the process of making that claim, there are two gestures that I think sensory historians are making. And the first is really a questioning of the power of the Enlightenment to elevate the eye to the exclusion of the other senses. And this, of course, is an argument famously associated with Marshall McLuhan and Walter Ong. And while they weren't entirely wrong, the Enlightenment did kind of recalibrate the ratio of the senses. I think their reception has been a bit muddled to the point where historians assume that we rely only on eyewitnesses as the arbiters of truth and knowledge and reason. And I'm not convinced that's true. I think there are many developments in modernity and pre-modernity that are indebted to all of the senses. And so fundamentally, the role of the sensory historian is to examine not just eyewitness evidence, but ear witness evidence, And then the second gesture is to radically contextualize this information, which of course answers your question about the lived experience. So what sensory history insists upon, at least as I understand it, is the idea that to experience the past is to understand it in its context. So there is a grave reluctance to universalize sensory experience and sensory meaning. That is to say, what was a sound, or what was a noise, or what was silence, or a touch, or any number of sensory experiences in, say, 1800 will not have the same meaning today, or even in 1900 or 1950, as it did to the person in 1800. And the reason for that is because historical context dictated the meaning of that particular sensory input. And that relies on all sorts of things that historians conventionally take very seriously. That is to say, time, constituency, place, all sorts of things that go to shape the meaning of something that historians would recognize in their regular work, but sensory historians are under a special obligation to place the meaning of the senses in very particular contexts. So it's really an effort not to universalize the sensory, and therefore not to universalize human experience. Experience can only be understood in its context and with its particular meaning at a particular time. So that's lived experience, right? So it has to be mediated in the past through the senses at a particular moment in time in a particular place by a particular constituency.
And what constitutes sensory knowledge in this context?
Well, that's a very good question. And I think and correct me if I'm wrong, but underlying that question is the idea that somehow this is a specialized kind of knowledge. And it's really not. And in fact, I think the idea that sensory knowledge is specialized itself says a lot about the sort of triumph of Enlightenment conceits. Sensory knowledge is, well, it would be seeing, right? I mean, it's a form of sensory knowledge. And historians rely on that form of knowledge validation all the time in their work. All we're doing is simply adding the other senses to that knowledge, or that body of knowledge, that then can do one of two things. Adding that sensory apparatus, recognizing that all of the senses have some relevance and come into play, not only textures the past, and gives it a more voluptuous understanding of the past, but it can also explain some causality that seeing alone cannot explain. If we're hostage to sight alone, then I think that we're playing a fairly dangerous game, both in terms of fully understanding the past and all of its texture, but also in trying to explain some very important moments in history that cannot be explained just by reference to the eye alone.
Not all historians are necessarily adepts of the history of the senses. And how would you convince historians or other historians like this, as well as anyone interested in the lived human experience, to incorporate senses in their analysis? And this actually gets to the question of how central are the senses to understanding this human experience, and how do you convince them to consider it as central?
Well, I'm trying to flog my own wares there, aren't I? I think there are lots of reasons why we should take the senses seriously in our work. How we go about that and the extent to which we do it is obviously a function of access to resources that we have and the kind of time that we have. But those limitations notwithstanding, here are the reasons why the senses need to be incorporated into really an accepted understanding of history. So first of all, imagine if our present were devoid of any reference to smell or taste or touch or sound, and that we relied exclusively on the ocular, on the visual, to explain and mediate our existence. We would come away with a very partial understanding of our own existence now. So I would say, since we don't want that partial existence and partial understanding now, why would we accept that as an understanding of the past? So the first point is very simple. If the duty of the historian is to examine and understand as fully as possible the past, then there is almost a kind of ethical obligation to at least recognize, if not engage, the full sensory apparatus of the past and the full sensory experience of the past. So I think that on a very basic level, if you want to examine the past, you're going to have to consider all of the senses. And historians are very thorough people usually. I mean, we go about this and we cross-reference all sorts of evidence. We rely on economics and politics and social history. But it's a kind of oddity that not that many people do sensory history. But let me just back up there for 1 second. I just repeated a conceit that I'm not sure is entirely true. And that is, sensory history is new, and sensory history is exotic, and sensory history is not practiced by many people. The first point I'd like to make is that it's not that new. And really the first part of the book that I just published this summer, A Sensory History Manifesto, is dedicated to exploring the genealogy of sensory history, which is a lot deeper than people often recognize. And to explore it, you have to go and read very carefully, especially the Annales school. The Annalists, really beginning in the 60s and through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, took the census seriously. You can go back further than that, of course, but professional historical writing started to take the census quite seriously beginning in the 1960s. Now, I can give you examples before then, but for the most part. And it's not to say that they were writing extensively on the census, but as the Annales school liked to say, this is a very kind of Catholic way of looking at the past. And so you had a variety of historians who would inject sound and taste and touch and all sorts of things into their conventional analyses. And then beginning really in the 1980s, the Annales school started to move towards a discrete analysis of the senses, really down to Alain Corbin more than anything else. And then, of course, at the same time, beginning in the early 90s and the late 80s, you have a number of sensory anthropologists, and I'm thinking here of David Howes in particular, and Constance Classen, who is also an historian, and they too were beginning to write these very interesting sensory treatises on sensory anthropology and aspects of the past. So there is, I think, a deeper history than people recognize. That's why, while people say there's a burgeoning field, I'm not quite convinced that it is as burgeoning and as new as people make out. Secondly, I think it's also worth pointing out that it's grown so quickly that it's quite difficult to keep a handle on how much is being produced, how much is being written, and where. I mean, there are very, very few areas, both temporally and geographically, that haven't been subject to some degree of sensory historical analysis. It's being written on in the ancient world. We're increasingly getting work from the Far East. I mean, pretty much everywhere and every place in time has attracted the attention of historians of the senses, and they might not even think of themselves as sensory historians. And that's probably very wise. I mean, they're historians of China, they're historians of Renaissance Italy, they're historians of the Second World War in Germany. I mean, they're historians, but they're increasingly recognizing that to attend to their discrete field, they need to at least acknowledge the role of the senses. And I think it's a very healthy development. So I'm not sure that I have a whole lot of persuasion to do, really, because I think it's already happening. It's been happening for a while, and historians are increasingly being inquisitive about the senses. They might not consider themselves sensory historians, but they are certainly historians who are taking the senses very seriously. And I think that's a very encouraging thing. Part of the little book that I wrote was really to survey the field as it is right now, but also to suggest directions that it might go into, but also some of the methodological issues that historians generally, but sensory historians in particular, will need to confront as they move their habit, their methodology forward. Because I don't think sensory history is a field, technically speaking. It's not like American history or British history. It's really a habit of looking at the past, a way of thinking about the past that can apply to any subfield of history, any geography, any temporality.
Yes, absolutely. I really think that your book on a Sensory History Manifesto has come to the right time, and you definitely convinced me as well as others, I'm sure. One question now is, do we have what we need? You mentioned methodology, interpretive practices, and so on. Do we currently have what we need to pursue this direction more deeply?
I believe that we do, and I believe that we've had these tools for as long as professional history has been written. And the reason I say that is oftentimes I'll give a talk and people will say to me, well, surely you need some kind of specialized evidence to excavate the smells of the past or to think about how touch functioned in the past. And I point out that, you won't go to a university cataloging system and type in smell and find manuscripts just on smell. It just doesn't work like that. You will go to your conventional category. Let's say you're looking at slaveholders in the 1850s in the American South, and you go to that category. Well, within those letters, within those diaries, there's all of the sensory evidence you'll need to write a sensory history in many ways. The difference is sensory history simply tunes your radar to detecting the evidence that's embedded in the text. It's already there. It's not like it's been hidden. It's not as though there was some special cache of information that was suddenly discovered attending to the senses in the past. It's always existed. What hasn't always existed is our ability, our determination, our curiosity about the senses, and our willingness to read in that granular level about sensory evidence that's embedded sometimes in very subtle ways, more often in very obvious ways in those conventional sources. I mean, I'll be very candid with you. I've rarely read a source, even the driest diplomatic correspondence, for example, where you wouldn't expect much by way of the senses or the sensate to emerge. I rarely read a source that doesn't have some reference to the senses. In fact, I'm doing a project at the moment on diplomatic history and the senses. And I'm not the first person to recognize this, but the senses are absolutely essential to unpacking the meaning of a particular moment in time, even in diplomacy. So it's not as though it's rare, it's not as though it's obscure, it's already there. So I do think in terms of methodology, all sensory history does is recalibrate your sensory radar and to make you aware of it. And I find this with students all the time when I teach sensory history at the university here. They often look perplexed at the beginning of the course and they're expecting some kind of dedicated evidence. And I said, no, let's choose something really tedious. Let's choose something you've even read before. But let's read it with a sensory ear or a sensory nose. So I think we have that. I think where we have to be careful is both professionally and then moving forward about how we use what we find. So professionally, I'm of the opinion that genuine movement forward, genuine interpretive movement in a particular field at a particular time is largely the product of robust but civil argument among historians. I think a field that agrees with one another, that the practitioners just pat one another on the back, is probably a field that's going to die. There's no interpretive or dialectical impetus to move forward. And I think that sensory history was in danger of suffering from that very pleasant camaraderie, but nonetheless quite dangerous camaraderie, because just because you have somebody who's working on the senses alongside you doesn't mean you should necessarily agree with them. And I think healthy dispute is a very important part of the process for field formation or habit formation. And so I have the honor of being the series editor for Penn State University Press, and we have a very robust series. But part of that conversation as an editor is I will push back and the authors will push back with me. And I think that helps advance the field. I think it's a good thing. So I do think we need to argue more, is a simple way of putting it. The other part of this is quite interesting. And I gesture towards this in the book, but I'm happy to speak about it a bit more now. And this is more of a worry that I have. I do think that some of the pressures in higher education, not just at American universities, but at European universities too. And I do a lot of grant evaluations for European universities and US universities. I do think some of the pressures, especially for historians, for folks in the humanities generally, and also in the sciences, I mean, this is not peculiar to the humanities, I think the pressure is to make their work relevant. In Britain, this is called impact. In the Netherlands, it's about relevance. In other words, how is your work relevant to contemporary society? And while I fully recognize that governments and granting agencies have the right to say, if you want money from us, you're going to have to make your work relevant. You're going to have to show us the social impact. I understand that. And it's not something I disagree with necessarily. But I think for sensory history, it's a very seductive and quite dangerous invitation, because the senses are very relevant, aren't they? Because we have them. And it's very easy to make the case that I'm going to produce a book on the history of smell that's going to have relevance, is going to have impact. I'm going to embark upon a curation of a museum or historic home that's going to incorporate the senses, and it's going to have impact. People are going to like it, and they're going to come to this museum because it's sensory. And you can see how you could make a very good case for the relevance and impact of the senses in that particular context. And it is seductive, and you're more likely to get your grant money if you do that. The trouble is, you have to be very careful with that. And I think this is an ethical point more than anything else. I think that if you start piping in smells and sounds to historic homes where visitors come, and you do it without explaining what you're doing, you're flirting with what is really a disingenuous and radically act of consumption, really, of the past. Because, as I said at the beginning, to understand the meaning of the senses requires you to contextualize them. And the illustration I just gave you is void of any contextualization whatsoever. And there's a sleight of hand going on there that says, well, what you're experiencing here is the smell of 1890. And that's what we're piping in. These are the sounds of 1800. That's what you're hearing. And that's manifestly not the case. And it's manifestly not the case because people in 1890 had a different interpretation of what a bad smell was or a good smell was than they do today. People in 1800 had a different interpretation of what a loud noise was, what a quiet noise was, or what noise was generally than they do today. That's why a tornado cannot sound like a freight train until freight trains are invented. In other words, context matters, discourse matters, words matters. Words matter. Context is the key here. So I think we have to be very careful about how we go about selling the senses in our work, despite the manifest temptations to secure grant funding by making things not just relevant, but almost palatable. You can consume this past. And I can talk more about that if you'd like, because I think there are many, many examples, especially in the United States, but not exclusively in the United States, where this happens all the time. Because we're not being very sort of rigorous about our examination, we let it pass. But in letting it pass, we're doing the public that we're supposed to be serving a grave disservice. They're not learning about the past. They're learning about their own conceits, their own quest for consumption, and their own fascination with a very modern tendency to embrace authenticity, whatever that might mean.
Yes, absolutely. And it's very popular and somewhat easy to monetize these days, but it's very, very tricky. So it's a critical point. And I do believe that we have to redefine relevance in academia as well, not only in one field, across many, many fields. But how to look at historical evidence with what you call a sensory ear or a sensory nose? For example, should the analyst, historian, and others consider the senses in isolation as analytically discrete categories, or should they consider them in combination as a tightly interrelated whole? And in fact, probably we should have started with this. How many human senses are out there? should we focus on the canonical 5 sense categories that have become very popular or brought to us by popular psychology? I know that you are critical of these siloed categories and practices.
Yeah, this is actually a very helpful way to access some of the deeper issues. Look, I mean, first of all, I do think that, like any field, it does need to grow, and it needs to grow within the capacity of what it has at a particular time. And I do think the analysts were looking at fairly discrete senses, although I will tell you that several of them deliberately made the case that you needed to look at intersensoriality, the way that the senses work together. They just didn't do much of it. And they didn't do much of it because it's quite difficult to do, I think. But nonetheless, they made that case. The way that the senses have been written since then, at least since really the 1980s, have largely been in discrete categories. So people will write a study of sound, or village bells, as Alan Corban did, and then they'll go on to a history of smell or history of touch. So they're discrete senses. And while that is problematic, I don't think it's especially problematic. And the reason why is because you need those building blocks. And virtually everybody who's written a book on one of those senses in any particular context has usually gestured towards the other senses in the text. So you can't really avoid it. But it's more of it is a contrivance. It is a function of what you can do, the limitations of what you can do in a time and place, to be sure. But I don't think it's deadly. I think it's actually quite helpful, because these books have allowed historians to move beyond treatment of the single sense. I think there are always going to be books just on one sense. I just think that's just part and parcel of what is manageable for some people, for some particular periods especially. But I think what it's allowed people to do is bring those separate books into conversation, because while you can be an expert on US history, the chances of you being an expert on US, German, and Chinese history are very remote. So you build on the books that have been written in order, for example, to do a transnational comparison of the senses. And so they're very helpful in that way. I suppose eventually the point will be to write an intersensory history of whatever period or place you're looking at, provided the evidence actually leads you down that path. Because it is worth bearing in mind that at some moments and some times and some places, some of the senses do come to the fore and occlude the other senses, or at least downplay the other senses. And I did a short book on the American Civil War a few years ago. And on the one hand, that was a very contrived book, because with each chapter, I focused on an event, a battle, a siege, and I tried to tease out the principal sensory signature of that event. Now, of course, in a battle, all of the senses are at play. But what I was trying to do is recognize what contemporaries said about the principal signature of that event. So I was trying to have a fidelity to the past, but at the same point in time, it is contrived. It is the nature of the beast. But now I'm working on the history of natural disasters. And natural disasters are extraordinarily multisensory and intersensory. So much so, for example, that an earthquake is at once a tactile event and an auditory one and a visual one, and sometimes an olfactory one too. And you cannot reduce it to one element. It has to be treated as an intersensory or multisensory event. They're two different things, really. A multisensory one is not the same as an intersensory one, but people, when they leave their evidence, when they write down their experiences, they're usually very careful to tell you what kind of senses were at play and how they played together. This question about the 5 senses, I think, is an excellent question. I mean, of course, when we're dealing with just 5 senses, we're just reinscribing Enlightenment conceits at the same time, aren't we? Because largely this is a Renaissance Enlightenment project about 5 senses being the only real number. But of course, before then, there was a 6th sense and sometimes a 7th sense. The 6th sense was usually considered to be intuition, the common sense, the way that you felt something, you intuited something, presumably because all of the other senses were combining and pointing you internal, intuitive sense in a certain direction. I see a lot more of that being written on today than I have before, largely courtesy of sort of psychology, the history of psychology, the way that early science took the sense of intuition seriously. So I think that we're actually moving back to a kind of pre-enlightenment, multi-sensory, beyond 5, perhaps 6. And then, of course, when you're looking at different cultures, there are other senses too. And so the more comparative work we do, the more likely it is that that number will expand. But for right now, we're kind of writing within the sensory coordinates of the 5-sense hierarchy. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that's absolutely appropriate because people in the past tended to live within that same 5-sense hierarchy in those coordinates. But it shouldn't preclude us from considering the role of intuition, for example, or the kind of the psychology underwriting that common sense.
Okay, so in your books that I mentioned earlier, you talk about the importance of analyzing and interpreting how people perceive, for example, how people of the past hear, how they see, and so on, and how to interpret their emotional meaning. What exactly do they mean by hearing in a particular way? And also how to access this understanding. And it's very interesting because you talk about accessing the understanding of the person of the past, as Corbin said, put the glasses on and try to feel what they felt. But there is another aspect there, which is accessing this understanding from the writer's point of view, the historian himself, herself, as well as the audience in the present. So how can we access this understanding from so many points of view? How does a historian solve this problem?
That's an interesting question, and let me try to answer that by telling you something of the origins of the book that I wrote with Rob Boddice, which I think does a much better job of answering that question than the book that I did this summer, which is a bit lighter on this topic. So several years ago, I gave a talk courtesy of David Howes at Concordia University, in which I offered this critique of sensory history as it was being written. And in the audience was Rob. And Rob Boddice, as you probably know, is a very distinguished historian of emotion. And afterwards he came up, he said, do you have time for a cup of coffee? And I said, I do. And we started talking. And it turns out that some of the criticisms I had of sensory history as it was being written, is largely a kind of universalist conceit, were the same criticisms that he had of the history of emotion and it was being written. And we decided that we were both on the same wavelength. And then, I don't know, a year or two later, we were invited to write really a short book precisely on this issue by Cambridge. And I learned a great deal from Rob on this because historians of emotion, while they do have similar challenges as historians of the senses, explained to me that we were really writing the same history. We were encountering the same problems, that it was really not just undesirable, but almost foolhardy to separate the senses and emotion, because in every instance, they seem to have to be in dialogue at least. And one of our difficulties was on how to access this problem of experience. And so I think we did a very good job in not straw manning everybody else. I think that we went through and pointed out some of the advantages, disadvantages, but ultimately the holes in the writing of history by historians of the senses and emotion. So fundamentally, what we did in that book was an attempt to understand not just the past in its context, but also how historians, when they're writing, also write in a very presentist fashion, and to try to kind of minimize some of the cobwebs that we have to dip through in order to access the past, which of course is very difficult because, and Rob wrote largely this section in the book on the importance of words and translation. And understanding translations is very important because if you don't use the right words in the right context, then you have warped the experience of the past and the experience of that individual. So the first point, I suppose, is an attention to detail and attention to context that's so contextualized that even the words have to be properly understood in their context. And the second is really to do with what we're doing at the time of writing, I suppose. And that has, and we come back to these larger forces in which we operate. So a good example would be the relevance issue, right? So what motivates us to write? And I think that motivation really matters because if you're motivated by the quest to be relevant or impact, then you're probably going to have a very talked or warped view of the evidence that you're entertaining. So it's that effective emotion sensory aspect in radical context that gives you the lived experience and the felt experience. And I think that's probably the most profitable way to think about this, rather than surrendering to universalist conceits, or even, and this is important, if you want to write an interdisciplinary history, and I think we should, I think it's really important not to surrender to any one particular discipline. And in our reading of the history of emotion, and to a lesser extent, the history of the senses, folks who had really tried to engage with the natural sciences sometimes surrendered to the protocols of the natural sciences rather than try to historicize those protocols. And I think that's where the humanities generally, and history in particular, can offer something very valuable to the natural sciences. But we haven't been able to do that, or we haven't done it as much as we should have wanted to do. And I think that's where our intervention matters, because we're calling for not just interdisciplinary that arranges a hierarchy of disciplines, but for a genuine, authentic, and equitable dialogue between not just folks in the humanities, but folks in the natural sciences and the humanities, but a kind of very honest exploration in which no one discipline really triumphs, if that makes sense.
Talking about silos of the sensory categories, absolutely, we have silos of disciplines. So we really have to do a better job to really connect them. And I'm saying this because you mentioned so many disciplines in your call for an interdisciplinary approach to the history of the senses. And one major problem is that, for example, humanities, social sciences, and the arts do not really connect well to the sciences. And I'm talking about STEM in general, but my personal interest is in artificial intelligence. And this is rather apparent in this recent history, or has been, due to a lot of criticism of how AI actually tries to solve these problems. So for example, how AI detects, processes, and interprets not only human emotions, but also answers all sorts of questions that are at the heart of fields such as history. So for example, sentiment analysis, in particular, how human happiness changes over time. And the researchers took a very large data set of about 200 books, and they applied all sorts of computational metrics. And one of the insights that they came up with at the time was that apparently Victorians were much happier than we are today. And that got historians, at least this is what the media popularized at the time, but that was a few years ago. You know what I'm talking about, right? Got historians upset because, again, happiness in general hasn't been rightfully contextualized. Now, moving toward technology and the gap between sciences and humanities, talking about the future 5-10 years from now, how do you see the role of technology, in particular artificial intelligence, but also neuroscience and others, in shaping our awareness and use of the senses, as well as the practices of the history of senses? And right now, for example, there is a lot of discussion on the role of immersive technologies, and the senses play a huge role here. How can these emerging technologies help historians or other practitioners of the felt experience of the others access the past by borrowing their glasses and leave their emotions, just to cite Corbin?
Yeah, so I realize that your terrific podcast is most interested in these sorts of questions, and this is probably my weakest element. I mean, I just don't ponder these things to the same extent, but I'll say this, and my understanding of this is largely through popular culture. I read something the other day in which touch screens are going to be revolutionized insofar as right now we touch something to actuate a reaction from the touch screen, but there is a technology afoot maybe in the next 5 or 6 years which will allow us to feel sharpness or softness or texture on the screen itself. I have a very, very generalized understanding of this. I do have, my reaction to all of this is a bit like my reaction to Civil War reenactors in the United States. And I apologize if this sounds clumsy and unthought through, because it probably is clumsy and underthought. But when people reenact battles, when people reenact Gettysburg, they think they're in an immersive technology. So they've got their uniforms on, and the uniforms are very carefully curated and calibrated to feel like it was. The other technology would be their rifles that they're firing from. The other technology would be cannons, right? So this is all designed to be an immersive technology. They want to recreate the sounds and the smells, even the tastes of the Civil War. They're eating tack that was eaten in 1863. So in a way, the immersive technologies of today are really they have a long history, right? They have a very long history of recreating something to be immersed in it sensorially. And of course, it's largely a myth, isn't it? Because people who reenact Civil War battles aren't reenacting Civil War battles with the degree of authenticity that they think they are. You can't stop an airplane flying overhead in 2021 during a reenactment of Gettysburg, but there wouldn't have been the airplane in 1863. 6,000 people died at that battle. The stench of that battle was overwhelming to the people at the time. But you shouldn't really want to recreate that in 2021. I suppose I'm interested then in motivation. Why this quest for immersion and the ability to say, oh, well, this is 1863. It probably has more to do with our own needs and our own conceits than it does with understanding people in 1863. People in the Civil War didn't reenact the Revolutionary War. Reenactments, historic homes, are really a 20th century conceit. They're a product of a consumer society that wants something that they believe to be authentic. And I don't know what the metaverse wants or people who engage in the metaverse want, but I bet you at some level they want some degree of authenticity. And I suppose that could look like an historical moment in many ways. I mean, if historians are going to be relevant to this metaverse, then I suppose they could be useful insofar as they could say to you, well, here's a scent from 1700 that has disappeared, that we don't smell anymore. It's a particular flower that doesn't grow anymore. And this is what it smelled like to somebody. So I suppose you could kind of recapture the past, give it a historical context, and say, you know, this is the nearest you're going to get to 1700 with this scent. I suppose you could do that. I guess my question is why? Like, what's motivating? Why do people want to do that? What is it? Because people in 1700 weren't doing that. What is it about us? And I think ultimately that might be the most operative question for me. It doesn't mean it's the only question, but for me, the question would be, what's motivating us to do this?
I think we like immersive experiences, and you mentioned all these shows and putting old clothes on and having cannons and so on. And in one way, we do this when we read fiction books, right? It is immersive experience then as well. At the core of this is authenticity, and history will have a major role to play here as well, because authenticity is exactly at the core of the historian's practice. I think we like to see how other people actually have felt in other periods of time. I'm a little bit intrigued by your question, because in the history of the sensory history, Corbin said to try to borrow the past people's glasses and live their emotions. Isn't this immersive experience? And if it is, I think the major question here is, to what extent is it possible to borrow other people's glasses, especially if they're dead, and live their emotions and feel their sensations? What is the upper bound on this?
Yeah, well, I mean, Corbin was very interesting when he said that, and I'm really glad that he picked up on that phrase because it's one of my favorites. So what are the limits to that? Well, it depends what you mean as what he meant, I suppose, by living their emotions. And again, I think this is a very modern idea, right? Like you don't really find these attempts to a sort of voyeuristic history. You don't really find people recreating historical battles and historic homes before the 20th century. And so in a way, this is more about us than I think the past. But to answer your question, what are the limits? I think sensory historians can be quite helpful here by reminding people the importance of context. But it's very tricky, isn't it? So in the book with Rob, I gave an example of what a genuinely interdisciplinary sensory emotional history looks like when you've got historians, psychologists, political theorists, and neuroscientists talking together. And that would be the example of disgustology and political science, right? So this brings to bear all of this, the historians, the psychologists, the political theorists, the scientists. And what they find today in modern democracies in the West is that you can distinguish between somebody who has a liberal political persuasion and somebody who has a conservative political persuasion by showing them images or having them smell or touch or engage with things that are deemed disgusting. And they find that liberals are much more tolerant of things that are disgusting than conservatives. And this has been validated by the political scientists. It's a very high, in terms of predicting voting patterns, it is more reliable than education or income as an indicator of how you're going to vote. So disgustology is a real thing. It has the backing of science, and it has a fair amount of social science, humanities, and neuroscience behind it. But here's where the historian and sensory history muddles it, and I think helpfully so. That only works with Western democracies in the past 10 years. If you go back to the 19th century, the very meaning of disgust was so radically different, it wouldn't apply. You couldn't really do the same analysis. You'd have to come up with additional metrics. And then there's the question of what emotions were available on the menu at the time. And there are emotions from the 19th century that were very, very important to people, as important today as disgust is. As important as disgust is as an emotion indicating behavior. But the 19th century emotion just doesn't have the same resonance today. So the example I gave in the book was the example of the emotion of indignation. And indignation was a very powerful emotion leading up to the American Civil War, in which abolitionists, pro-slavery thinkers invoked indignation as a way to convey their political sentiments. And it was as relevant for them as disgust is for people today. But you ask people today if they're indignant about something, and there'd be a sort of shrugged shoulders, like, what? I don't even recognize that as legitimate emotion sometimes. In other words, I think as long as you are aware that each period, each constituency, each time and place has a possible different menu of emotions and senses, then you can begin to make sense of immersion. But it's not as clean and as unmediated as what I think of as when I think of the metaverse or immersion, which seems to be, there's a quietly smuggled in universalist idea. I might be wrong about that, and I'm happy to be wrong about that. But from my perspective, the past is messier and it's more difficult and it's more jagged, and you have to sort of suspend your assumptions about what is now might not have been then, and what was then might not even exist now. So it's very, very difficult, I think, to have this broadly immersive experience when really immersion can only make sense if you contextualize it.
For sure. So let's try to wrap up by turning now to the current pandemic, the COVID-19. You wrote a section in the book where you focused especially on this, and you said that there has been a shift in emotions and senses, political sensibilities, accompanied by a different set of sensory triggers. What do you mean by this? You also mentioned that we are now undergoing a sensory revolution. How come?
So that part of the book I'd experimented with and wrote a popular piece in April when the pandemic was unfolding and the public health protocols were being enacted, that people were staying home, there were lockdowns. And this was actually, I think it was May, and so it'd been a few weeks, maybe a couple of months, and we were beginning to see the impact of the pandemic and the protocols underwriting the pandemic. And this was really just a kind of casual observation, and I just wrote a brief essay on a sort of the pandemic and the sensory revolution, which was picked up in the popular press. But what I was trying to say is it took decades, sometimes centuries, for sensory protocols to be established, for the idea, for example, that seeing is believing. It wasn't always that way. If you go back to the medieval period, that phrase, seeing is believing, was longer. It was seeing is believing, but feeling's the truth, i.e. tactility mattered too. It was as powerful an authenticator of knowledge as seeing. The Enlightenment changes that. The hand drops away, the eye is elevated. And what I was trying to do is say, hang on a minute, this pandemic has kind of altered some of these very basic long-term sensory protocols that we've inherited from the Enlightenment. And one of them was seeing, because I wasn't sure that seeing was believing in every instance anymore, courtesy of masks. So you've probably had this experience with your students or people that you know. You can spend an entire semester with students who are masked and not know what they look like. And there's an instability that comes with that. So the eye is a less powerful authenticator of knowledge than it had been before. The same is true with sound, right? So one of the real signatures of the pandemic, at least initially, was silence or relative quiet. New York didn't sound like New York. And there was a couple of big pieces in the New York Times about how people were hearing birds much more frequently and with greater volume than they had ever before. Well, that's not because the birds had changed, it's because the traffic had dropped off, and therefore there was no background noise to occlude the sound of birds. The way that touch had been effaced during the pandemic. Look, you know, I mean, 2 centuries of handshaking habits in American culture suddenly disappeared from a sort of social landscape. People just did not touch one another. They did not shake hands because of the protocols of the pandemic. Taste also changed, right? So the idea that you could go out to a restaurant, get a hot meal that wasn't soggy, that was tasty, that was suddenly suspended because all you could, the best you could do, at least initially, was get takeout, which meant that things were cold, things were not crisp, and things didn't taste as good. And then, of course, that was also reflected in food stores and grocery stores. Some places ran out of meat and milk early on and things like this. So when I said it's a revolution, I kind of, in a way, I meant a revolution, right? So it was a kind of arcing back to a kind of pre-Enlightenment reconfiguration of the hierarchy of the senses. And I didn't know how long it was going to last. I still don't know how long it's going to last. I don't know if it's an enduring sensory revolution, but there was something pretty profound going on, that a pandemic of this nature, with this particular signature as a respiratory disease that could be communicated in the following ways, changed the ways that we behaved, but in the process, changed the ways that our senses functioned and mediated our social relations with one another. And I think that's a good illustration of the matter of context, because it reminded me of the importance of context. If you're going to look at history and say, well, 50 years from now, an historian will look back and say, well, the first half of the 21st century was this sensorially. Well, that's a pretty big statement. You're going to have to look at 2019 and 2020 as disruptors of that sensory experience, if in fact they prove to be.
Yes, for sure. Mark, I really enjoyed our conversation today. I enjoyed your books, The Emotion, Sense, and Experience and Sensory History Manifesto. I learned a lot from them. I'm a computational linguist, artificial intelligence scientist myself, and I really believe that sciences can benefit a lot from history, humanities, social sciences, and the arts. And we should try to find better ways to connect these still isolated areas today, in particular, because AI is moving toward these immersive technologies. Is it good? Is it bad? We don't know. Every technology has two sides. We're going to see where it goes. But thank you so much. How can our audience learn more about you, your books, and your research, your work? Where can they find you?
They can find me at the University of South Carolina, where I am in the history department, and I'm also the director of the Institute for Southern Studies. So you can find me on 2 web pages, and either one will get you to where you need to be.
Thank you so much for your time, Mark. This was great.
It's been a real pleasure. I really appreciate it. Thank you.